Hi, this is Adrenakrohm. Welcome back to the Filterverse modulation series. This time we're looking at the envelope follower. This one's really quite flexible, so let's get started. The envelope follower in Filterverse has a split personality. Whenever the threshold is all the way down to the bottom, it is a full-time envelope follower and follows the amplitude of the incoming signal. However, when it's set to anything but 0, it acts as a regular envelope and is triggered each time the audio crosses the threshold. Then we have the trigger sources for the envelope follower, and that can either be the input on the current track itself, a sidechain, or the output of Filterverse. The input is quite straightforward, and you might use that to create an auto-wire effect, which we'll get to later. Sidechain will be used if you want to apply the dynamics of a different track to the track that you're currently on. So an example would be ducking a pad or ducking a kick for a bass line, for example. However, once you've processed any changes in Filterverse, that obviously changes the output, so you may wish to use that changed output signal to re-trigger the envelope follower. Alright, so let's listen to some examples now. Example 1, I'm going to apply an auto-wire effect to this little funky guitar. Now if I turn Filterverse on, we have that auto-wire neutron-like effect. So what do we have going on? We have the envelope follower assigned to cutoff, although that just changes the depth for how much effect you want. Cutoff turned down to 36, that's just preference. We can turn that up if we want. Resonance up, and then we have it assigned to a bandpass filter type. We can play with the curve, shorten that. Super cool, really nice. So here we have the volume of the guitar interacting with the envelope follower, and as you might imagine, it's really quite responsive to real-time playing. Let's move on to the second example now, and that is using Filterverse as a compressor. So if we turn Filterverse off, we have this drum loop. Now I want you to pay attention to those tails. Right, so now we have a bypass on this one, a bypass filter type, it's still obviously working. And then we have the envelope follower assigned to the filter outputs with negative modulation. So every time the kick and the snare hit, the volume will be reduced, acting like a compressor. Let's just give it a bit of output. And off. You can really hear those tails a lot more pronounced now. Super cool. Or we can do the opposite. We can turn the level down and we can change the modulation to a positive. And now those little tails will disappear and we'll only have the kick and the snare. Going back to the compression momentarily, like so, let's put this back up around there. We can use the output. It results in a lot smoother compression. Versus the input. Both work, but I think I prefer the output version. Right, so moving on to the next example now, and that is ducking a pad via a drum loop. Once again, we're using the bypass module. However, in this case, we're using the sidechain function. Ensure that you have the sidechain set up in your DAW. I'm not going to go into detail on how to set this up because each DAW is specific, but make sure you read the manual. Essentially, you need the input from the drum loop feeding into Filterverse. So this is how it looks in Cubase. I have the house loop set as a send as a sidechain source into Filterverse. Turn the little sidechain button on, and then we have the envelope follower attached to the main output, like so. So every time the kick and the snare hit, then the envelope follower will receive that signal via the sidechain and then apply that to the filter output. So playing this back now with Filterverse enabled. Or if we turn the loop down. Or with Filterverse off. Or now ducking with the loop. There we go. So moving on to the next example now, we're going to use the same concept essentially, but add rhythmic life to pads. So in this case, we're using the same pad, but with a different loop. We still have the sidechain enabled, exactly the same as before. I've changed it from the bypass to a Swiss Army knife. I've taken the modulation from the envelope follower off the output, and I've reassigned it to the cutoff with a positive modulation. So now when I play this back, every time the kick and the snare hit, that will cause a rise in the cutoff. Like so. Really like this one. Nice. And then moving on to the next example, which is a sidechain kick. Some of you might remember years and years ago, there was a reactor patch called Kick and Bass Solver. And what that did was create a sidechain for the bass. So it would take the input from the kick and apply a high pass cutoff to the bass to allow room for the kick to not interact with the bass too much. And we can do exactly the same thing here. So in this example, I've changed the filter type to a clear glass. I want it perfectly transparent. The cutoff is all the way down. The type is a high pass, and I've attached the envelope follower to the cutoff. Once again, we have sidechain enabled, and that's coming from the kick. So if I turn this off now, let's have a listen to what we have as the source sound. When I play back just the bass by itself, you'll hear it's straight eighth notes. So there's no room there at all for the kick or snare. And with Filterverse off, you can hear it's quite muddy, they're both fighting for space. But when I turn Filterverse on, you can hear that frees up room for the bass. Really nice. So now you can hear all three elements have room to breathe and they're not fighting for space in the mix. Next up, we're going to use Filterverse as a ducker for a reverb or a decay. So in this example, I have this vocal loop. I want to add a bit of delay to that. So let's turn Filterverse on. We're going to turn the envelope follower off. Here we're using tempo delay set to 1/8 dotted with the feedback up and then the dry wet set to 31%. So let's hear this delayed vocal now. So it sounds quite good, but it's quite muddy when the delay and the dry signal are playing at the same time. So let's turn the envelope follower on, and then we have the envelope follower assigned to the dry wet level with a negative modulation. So now when the vocal plays, that will reduce the level of the wet signal, so we only have the dry, and then when it comes back to silent, then the delay will take over. Much cleaner. We can do a similar thing but with reverb. Let's flick over to reverb. We have exactly the same setup. We have 31% with a negative modulation on the dry wet. Play this back. Or off. And on again. Or let's put them both together and we'll turn the envelope follower off for both. We could obviously turn the dry wet down, but I like the effect. I like the total effect. I just don't like that it's messy. Let's turn the envelope follower on now. Much cleaner. I much prefer that. Moving on to the final example, we can use Filterverse as a gate. So in this example, we have this drum loop. I like the majority of that loop, but I don't like those hats, so I want to get rid of them. So let's turn Filterverse on. We're going to assign the envelope follower to the output level. The output level is currently all the way to minimum, but we're using envelope follower to drive an increase in the output level, only when the threshold is exceeded. So now you can hear those hats completely disappear. That's too much, but there I think. So here the output is only increased during the louder sections of the loop, so the quieter sections are completely ducked. So thanks for watching, and I'll be back next time with the random generator. See you then, bye bye.